bacteria in your gut is like a forest. You have these keystone species, and whether it's a pine forest or a mix of pine and oak and beech, that's all established by the age of 6 or 7.
This is Sick Health with Kevin Ban, MD. Our show helps you navigate our confusing healthcare system so you can take control of your own health. Today, I had an opportunity to catch up with my good friend, Alan Moss. He is a physician and scientist. He's done research on Crohn's, colitis, and the gut biome. He trained at Harvard Medical School and is currently faculty at Boston University's School of Medicine. He is also the chief scientific officer at the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. We talked about a lot of things today. We got into the microbiome and how gut health impacts our overall health, but we also get into diet, the environment, how autoimmune diseases are impacted by gut health. We talk about C-sections and breastfeeding and whether or not they have an impact on the microbiome, along with some very practical advice about what you can do to maximize your gut health. And now, my conversation with Alan Moss. Thank you for joining me. We've tried to do this a couple of times, and we finally made it. Thanks for joining the show.
Kevin, great to be here and looking forward to having a chat with you.
Same. Before we get into this, and I'll tell you, gut health is really something I'm interested in. It's one of those things that you hear so much about, and yet in the early part of my training, we never talked about it. So I want to go there. But before we do, I want to know more about you, which is strange because I've known you for almost 15 years now, and I really don't know much about your trajectory. I know you're from Dublin. I know you ended up here. We ended up working together at Harvard Medical Faculty Physician here in Boston. More importantly, we've worked together to realize a rail trail in our hometown. We live in the same town. But tell me about you. How did you get from Dublin to Boston?
Sure. You could argue it's a well-beaten path, right? So I went to medical school in Dublin. I graduated in the late 90s. In the Irish and UK medical system, there's a lot of training positions, but very few attending physicians, unlike in the US where there's lots of attending physicians. So most people who interested in research, want to do an academic career, have to at some point in their training historically go to the US or the UK or Europe to really get some extra expertise. And so when I'd finished my GI training in Dublin, an opportunity came up to come to the US for 1 year to Boston and work in the lab. 15 plus years later, that I'm still here. And, it was a great opportunity because I got to move to Boston, work in a fantastic lab, but work with some really great experts in GI research at Beth Israel. And then from there, really enjoyed the experience and decided, wow, I think this is for me. I fit here. I fit in this academic environment. I'd like to stay on, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that your wife did the exact same thing. Aoife is also a physician, and so you guys did this together, and now you have a family raised in the United States.
I like to say I brought over I brought over one small boy. I had 3 small boys, and now I have these 3 lanky Celtics Pats fans. That was not expected. And my wife, she will say she came kicking and screaming over here. And then I forced her to come. But now, she's also found her niche and she totally loves it too.
Well, I'm so glad you came here. We've had a lot of fun, mostly around trying to get that rail trail up and running. But enough of all this stuff. Let's get into today's topic, which is gut health. It's one of those things you hear about now all the time. And yet, when I trained and finished medical school over 25 years ago and nearing 30, although I don't actually want to say that, we never talked about gut health. That was not a thing. And now I would say over the course of the last 15, 20 years, some of the research that was happening is starting and has made it into sort of the common media. What's your take on that? Why 0 20 years ago and now so much?
I think that's a great point. And I even recall when I was in medical school, the chapter on the GI system was all about salt, water, and vitamins. And that was it, right?
Yeah.
And now you look and there's this huge field. So what happened? The main thing happened was the science to be able to take a stool sample, for example, and from that determine what bacteria live there, what species are there, what they're doing in terms of function, suddenly unlocked all this. And prior, the only way to know what bacteria were there to try and culture them in the lab, which is very slow and tedious. Now we can tell from a tiny sample all the different families and species of bacteria, and also now what fungi live in your intestinal tract, what viruses live in your intestinal tract. We can determine all that now from a small amount of material through advances in techniques. So that then, of course, opened the door to saying, okay, we've got all these conditions, and now we can associate them with changes in the microbiome, changes in the viruses, and suddenly now we have a huge area of research just around gut health and gut function. The second thing that happened is we were able to discover that all these organisms are not just passive passengers who are just living in your body. It's like a symbiotic relationship. You gain from what they're doing, and they gain from what your body is doing. And it's like a really important ecology that we didn't appreciate before.
Before we get into that relationship of the microbiome, gut health, and then my overall health, let's talk a little bit about what it looks like to have poor gut health. For the person listening right now, it might be like, well, do I have good gut health or do I have bad gut health? Where do you start with that?
So it's a spectrum, and most of us, even people who have a lot of disruption in their gut functioning, may not know about it, right? It could be relatively quiet in the background until it becomes a big deal, until you, for example, start having loose stool, or you just can't go to the bathroom. So it can be either end of that spectrum. You start seeing blood in your stool. You start failing to absorb and losing weight. They're on the extreme of something definitely is wrong. And in the middle, then we have people who have a lot of bloating, intermittent constipation, just don't feel well. It's often described as having a brain fog because they just feel like something's going on in their gut. And that's in the middle of the spectrum. But even some people who feel totally fine can have small things changing. You know, one of the big things we're encouraged to do is get screened for colon cancer, because you can have small polyps growing in your colon for many, many years and feel nothing until they start causing problems. But there's a wide range of spectrum of feeling totally fine to having diarrhea and bleeding, and lots of variations in between.
What are the indications to screen for gut health? For example, I've never done that. What would be some indications if a person, or a physician for that matter, think that, hey, this could be a gut health problem. This is a microbiome problem, and therefore I want to screen. What are the indications to go ahead and be tested?
So there are no standardized recommendations about when to do a gut microbiome test, mainly because the testing right now is very blunt. If you did a stool test right now, first of all, it's only available in a very limited number of labs, most of them commercial labs. You get a test done, it will say, here are all the bacterial families live in your colon or your intestinal tract, and here's maybe this species, and that's it. Where the big gap is now between knowing that information and knowing how to change it, or does it need to be changed, right? If you and I, Kevin, did 2 stool microbial samples tomorrow, I might get a profile that looks totally different to yours. Does that mean my gut is healthy or not healthy? No, it means I have a different ecology to you, but we've probably always had that. And so the baseline for what's normal for you in terms of microbiome may be totally different to what's normal for me.
That's really helpful. And so I think the takeaway is that a call to the physician right now for, hey, I want to check my gut biome is not in order, but pay attention to some of those symptoms that you talked about earlier, because those absolutely could be related to your gut health. One of the questions that is commonly discussed is diet and its impact on the gut biome. I can tell you, I am all the time wondering whether or not I should be eating yogurt, and if so, what type of yogurt? How about sauerkraut and kimchi and all these fermented foods? What is the diet impact on the microbiome?
So it's a very important two-way street, right? The microbes living in your intestinal tract, they depend on you eating to get their nutrients, right? If they're functional normally, they signal back to your gut to help your gut function normally. So it's a very important relationship. When we talk about diet and gut health, most people are looking at things like diversity. Do you have a diverse family of bacteria living in your intestinal tract? And diversity is associated mostly with being beneficial. So the things that drive diversity on the diet side are things like, do you have a diet rich in fruit and vegetables? Do you have a diet that's diverse in terms of mix of nutrients? If you, for example, are always eating red meat and very little fruit and vegetables, you end up with a far less diversified microbiome than someone who's a very diversified diet. And that can go from the gamut from, you mentioned yogurts. There are lots of bacteria and what are called prebiotics, which feed bacteria in yogurts. Kimchi, fermented foods are also the same category. But then even simple things as broccoli, apples, oranges all encourage healthy bacterial growth to maintain a stable microbiome. So I would summarize that by saying a diverse diet encourages a diverse microbiome, which you know is associated with good health.
That's helpful because I'm constantly asked about that. What about people who tend to eat only certain types of food? Commonly, that might be the carnivore diet. That's the one that you alluded to. And there are other diets, but your recommendation in general is that there be a variety, and then that'll correspond with a variety of bacteria in our gut that are going to actually help for healthy processing of foods.
To emphasize that point, if you were to only feed one type of food every day to your gut microbiome, you would imagine that that's really going to shrink who thrives on that type of diet. And other bacterial families will just like, you know what, I can't thrive on that. I'm going to not be able to reproduce and populate the gut. So you will drive towards a very narrow band of bacteria if you're always eating the same thing every day.
What impact on one's health would that have? So if I have a very diverse set of bacteria and it is good overall for health, but it would seem that the opposite is true. What happens then to people who have a very narrow group of bacterium in their gut?
Well, a lot of this is based on what we call association studies, where you look at one scenario and see what's there. And so we do know that people who have certain conditions, maybe they're inflammatory conditions or others, generally have a far less diverse microbial composition than those who don't have those conditions. And so we infer from that, or we think that in general, having a very narrow range of bacteria that's not diversified is probably not beneficial. Now, we can't say, though, for certainty that if you get this small range of bacteria, it's going to be bad for you. But we do know that people who end up with some of these conditions have a generally less diverse bacteria than those who don't have those conditions. So that's the way we think of it. It's an association, not a definite causation.
That's a problem often with research where we see on one day wine is good for you, the next day wine is bad for you. One day coffee is good for you, the next day coffee is bad. What usually is the common thread when you see that type of research is that they are not causation studies that are well-designed studies to prove causation. They are instead associations, they're correlations, and therefore, we're making assumptions almost based on what we're learning.
Yeah, a great example there would be if you say a study that says, okay, we took 20 people with colitis and we looked at their microbiome, and we took 20 people without colitis and looked at their microbiome. If the patients with colitis had a different microbiome to the patients without colitis, you might then say, well, the microbiome is the reason they have colitis, okay? Because you're associating the two and assuming causation. But in fact, it may be that because they have colitis, their microbiome has changed, right? So often there's a chicken or egg question around these studies. And generally we would say to clarify as something truly a causative effect, you really need to disrupt the environment with some intervention and then prove that that disruption caused it versus just saying condition X is there, therefore Y must be the cause of it. That's not strong enough evidence to make those causation links.
I'm going to go deeper into one food in particular here, and that's yogurt. Largely because my wife this morning, as we were talking about this interview, Kate said to me, hey, yogurt is supposed to be good for you, but what type of yogurt? Are all yogurts created equally? And I promised that I would ask that question. So unpack yogurt.
So the assumption with yogurt is the beneficial properties of the fact that it has bacteria living in it. Often lactobacilli is a very common one that you find in yogurt. In that scenario, yes, yogurt in moderation would make sense. You're introducing healthy bacteria into your system, which may help supplement what's there. But on the other side, if you're lactose intolerant, yogurt may cause you gas and cramps, right? So it's not the yogurt per se, because maybe for you, the dairy is not good for you. It's the bacterial composition of yogurt that we assume is beneficial. I will say that you could eat yogurt all day, right? Every day, but that may not be good for you because there's only so much additional bacteria you can add into the system before the rest of them just cannot thrive. If you think of your bacteria in your gut as like a forest, right? you have these keystone species that are, let's say it's all pine trees or it's all oak trees, and they've been there since you were a child. And you can introduce small other plants along the way, but the keystones haven't changed. And most of us build our microbiome by the age of 6 or 7. You've established what your forest, if you like, looks like. And as you age, you will add and change things, but that keystone structure is established in childhood.
That's a really helpful analogy for people to understand. And I think to a certain extent, sometimes the enemy of good is perfect. And oftentimes people are looking for the perfect diet. And what I'm hearing from you loud and clear is diversity is a really good thing. And if you overdo, for example, yogurt, that may turn out to be just the opposite. How influential and important is environment on our gut health?
So environment is important, and probably, we've moved through 2 phases in microbiome research. The initial phase was all about food because that's the obvious connection. We eat food every day. We're now realizing beyond that, your environment, so who you interact with, what you're breathing in, what's in the food you're ingesting beyond just the nutritional value influences your microbial composition. The basis here, for example, is social contact. We meet people, we shake hands, we embrace. As a child, that's passing skin microbes from your family, your social contacts to you. And that's part of the way you, for example, build your skin microbiome. And we also think it's part of the way you build your gut microbiome, those initial social contacts. The air you breathe, if the air you breathe is full of pollutants, that, and some increasing work now is recognizing, that can influence the composition of your microbiome. And so we are what we eat, but we are where we live, and who we live with also forms important. And I'll emphasize this by a great work I saw a couple of years ago where someone said, if you go to a conference, a big conference, and there's 1,000 people there, and you're social networking, and you're all shaking hands and hugging and sharing drinks, you will leave that conference with a small, tiny percentage shift in your skin microbiome from all the people you've met. And that will invariably translate to some small, very, very small shifts to your intestinal microbiome because of all those social interactions.
Well, this makes me think immediately of conversation you see in the media around the pandemic and what impact it had as we were less exposed, right? So you're essentially saying here that exposure is good for us. It's good for us overall, whether that's skin biome or gut health. Exposure to other people is a good thing. So what happens when we reduce exposure? And for the amount of time we did, is that consequential or not really, because we can quickly catch up whatever might have been lost?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Most disruptions in your gut microbiome are transient, right? You get sick, your microbiome changes, you recover, it goes back to normal. And the people who've done this, where they've measured their microbiome on a daily basis over like 6 months or a year, could see those subtle changes when they had a minor viral illness, they changed their food, small shifts. But the overall architecture pretty much stays very stable. Now, during the pandemic and social distancing, yes, we were doing less socially, but we were still interacting with our immediate circle, right? Our family, our friends, for the most part. We were living in the same home or same environment. So that didn't change a huge amount. What we did see that certainly people who were infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus did experience a change in their microbiome as a consequence of being infected. And you can, in fact, detect the virus in their stool. So it infected right through into their intestinal tract also. So overall, those changes would have been minor and transient and not permanent shifts.
Okay, so we can put that to sleep to a certain extent, because I've been asked about that as well. One of the pieces of advice I give is that exposure is good for a young child, but exposure is good for all of us. There are people that want to bubble wrap at times their kids, especially when they send them off to school for the first time. But these are actually good things. And while they're not easy things, because oftentimes they're like petri dishes who come home and then get us sick, the truth is that the human condition, to a certain extent, is a good thing. And we are meant to be in community. And this helps not only skin biome, let's call it, but also gut health.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, you have to train your immune system from very early on to recognize what's a danger and what's something that's symbiotic, that's no harm to you, right? And the only way to train your immune system is to expose it to multiple different viruses, bacteria, food antigens, and so forth. And that slowly trains your immune system during childhood to recognize, okay, most of these things are benign, are not going to harm me, but some of these are dangerous and a threat. And it's very hard to train your immune system if it's not exposed to a good variety of things during childhood.
You're talking about the early days, you're talking about childhood, and immediately there are two things that come to mind. The first is a lot of conversation, a lot of chatter about C-sections and their impact on the gut biome. And then the second one is breastfeeding. And mind you, these are two things that we can't do anything about. I was actually born by C-section, and there's nothing you can do about the fact that you were born by C-section. So let's start there. C-section, what's its impact on gut biome?
So let's think about if you're born through the traditional way, through the vaginal canal, you pick up a lot of bacteria along the way, right? And that influences your skin and your gut microbiome. And in the past, the argument was made that, well, if you're born by C-section, you miss out on those that passing through that canal. The good news is that that difference is only transient. And that very quickly in the months after birth, you then will, through contact with your parents, your siblings, your mother, get acquired and acquire those bacteria. So while there may be subtle differences at birth, they're not permanent. And through normal social interactions with your mother and parents, you will then acquire the same bacteria that you may have missed out on by not going through the vaginal canal. So we don't want to hold anyone to, oh, you only need a C-section, you're missed out. You may have missed out on some skin bacteria, but it's very transient and doesn't really impact long-term health.
That's helpful. Okay, maybe a change, but transient, move on.
Correct.
Breastfeeding, what's its impact?
So same with breastfeeding. Infants who are breastfed, there's a couple of things going on, right? There's very close physical contact during breastfeeding. There are certain nutrients within the breast milk that are good and diversify the microbiome. But again, if you're not breastfed, and as long as you go through after if it's formula feeding period, a good diversified diet, you will catch up and recover and acquire those organisms that maybe you didn't get by not being breastfed. And because you've got 6 or 7 years of life to build your microbial architecture, so you will catch up whether you're breastfed or formula fed eventually. So we don't want to hold it against people who are not breastfed on missing out. They will recapture those organisms over time.
Right. So once again, whether C-section or whether or not you were breastfed or not, it ultimately doesn't matter. It may matter maybe in the early years.
Short term.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You said 6 to 7 years. Is that how long it takes to establish? By that age, have the trees in the forest essentially been established?
Correct. When people look at the diversity of your microbiome, it's really rapidly growing until about the age of 7 or 8, and then it plateaus off. And you're still small fluctuations year to year, but really at that stage, you've built your core trees, if you like, in your forest are established. And whether it's a pine forest or a mix of pine and oak and birch, that's all established by the age of 6 or 7.
One of the things that I hear a lot about too is autoimmune disease and its association with gut health. As I think back on my training, that was never something that was taught or that we acted upon. But that feels like that has changed a lot over the course of the last 15, 20 years. Why? What is happening with gut health and its impact on autoimmune disease?
Yeah, essentially, once the research unlocked a better way to measure the microbiome, then suddenly everyone wanted to say, well, condition X, Y, and Z, some of which are autoimmune conditions, do they have different microbial composition to other conditions? One example is my area of interest is Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. We know from multiple studies that patients who have these conditions have a different composition of the microbiome to people who don't. Now, the question has always been, well, which comes first, the abnormal microbiome or the autoimmune condition? And that has been much harder to tease out. If you look at some conditions where they follow people who are at risk of, let's say, colitis or type 1 diabetes, and look at them from very early on, look at their stool samples, there is a subtle difference in their microbial composition. So there may be some element of causation there. But then once they develop the autoimmune condition, major changes can be seen. So it's probably a two-part story. Some of it may be early changes. Some of it may be your microbiome shifts in response to having an autoimmune condition like colitis or Crohn's disease. This has generated a lot of questions about, can you change the microbiome and correct it or reset it in this scenario? And it turns out that actually is much harder to do than we initially anticipated based on some of the research.
Are you referring to fecal transplant when you say a reset? Is that something that you're thinking about?
Well, so that is one example of trying to disrupt the microbiome. I rarely call these a reset because what we know is we're not resetting to something different. We're trying to reset to how it was before the disruption. So I think it would be a restoration of normal function rather than resetting to a different type of microbiome.
Got it. And am I remembering correctly that you have done a fair amount of research around fecal transplant?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was involved in the first trial looking at giving fecal transplant to patients with Crohn's disease to see did it make their Crohn's disease better. And the summary of that was that it did, but only for a short period of time. So we weren't really resetting their microbiome. We were transiently changing it in a good way, but we weren't giving them a new microbiome that suddenly reset the whole system.
Got it. So if someone's listening to this right now and says, hey, I think that I may have an unhealthy gut biome for all the reasons that you mentioned earlier, they're having some sort of GI upset, whether constipation or diarrhea or other symptoms that you mentioned. Is there a reset? Like, is there something that you would say is helpful for trying to reset things, or no, because you tend to work around the edges because our gut biomes are the way they are?
Yeah, for the most part, our gut biomes are the way they are. As we talked about, this is something that you acquire in childhood and really stable during your life. But if you have a major change, like let's say you're a person who goes once a day and then suddenly you're going 10 times a day, something definitely is wrong there. You need to get checked out. You need to make sure, get your stool test for infections. If all those things are negative and the assumption is something has shifted in your gut microbiome, there are things that have been looked at. Now, none of them are definitive to change things. And the examples would be, trying a course of probiotics, trying to change your diet to increase more prebiotics. We tend to avoid antibiotics, but there are a small number of conditions where antibiotics are appropriate that involve the gut microbiome. And particularly here, I'm talking about small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, but that's a very specific diagnosis. For the most part, adding in probiotics, adding in prebiotics may help restore the disruption or recover the disruption, but by themselves, they may not be sufficient because we don't fully understand the exact way to in your words, reset the microbiome.
Okay, what I want to do here now is I want to go deep into some practical advice to improve your gut health. But before we do that, here's a word from our sponsor. C2 Sense is doing important work with its Halo platform, applying technological advances in chemistry, machine vision, and material science to provide both patients and providers with laboratory-level accuracy at low cost when they need it. The pandemic reinforced the importance of being able to test in the privacy of your own home. C2 Sense's goal is to use their patented technology to ensure the same quality of testing you would find in your doctor's office in the comfort of your own home. So if you're suffering from upper respiratory symptoms like cough, sore throat, nasal congestion, or a headache, keep your eyes out for C2 Sense as they're developing tests targeting upper respiratory conditions such as COVID and flu. If you want to learn more, see what they're up to at haloreader.com. Alan, it is time to get extremely practical. One of the things I want to make sure is that we discuss not only the science, but also what they can do. So if I put you on the spot, what are the 3 things that people should do to improve their gut health?
In order of importance and impact, I would say number 1, a healthy lifestyle, healthy diet. So we know that things like exercise encourage a healthy gut in terms of microbial composition and diversity. A healthy, diversified diet, we talked about rich mix of fruit and vegetables, fibers, legumes, that kind of good mix of things is really important. That would be number 1. Because remember, you're the host for all these bacteria. A healthy host is a healthy microbiome.
I'm going to lay into that because on the show before I have talked frequently, Alan and I are looking at each other right now, even though this is an audio podcast. And behind me on my whiteboard, I have written out a bunch of wellness things that I was discussing, like sleep, diet, exercise, stress mitigation. You mentioned there exercise, diet, of course, but also stress impacts the gut health as well. So if one were to try to just lessen stress, my guess is that is also better for your gut health. Is that true?
Yes. And this is an important thing because there is a direct connection between your gut microbiome and your brain. And it's a two-way connection. Some of the studies looking at this have seen that some of the chemicals released by your gut microbiome can signal to the brain and vice versa. And so a stressed brain sends different signals to the gut microbiome than a relaxed brain. So I totally agree with you. Stress mitigation, very important. We're increasingly recognizing a good night's sleep consistently is also important for physiology, including gut physiology. And so if you can do those things, if you can minimize the stress in your life, get a great night's sleep, have a healthy, wide-ranging, diversified diet, plenty of fruits and vegetables, and exercise, that's the winning quadruple hit, if you like.
The funny thing about this conversation is that even though we know, and the WHO has put out that 80% of chronic disease can be prevented or even treated, maybe not perfectly, but can be improved with those factors. And about 40% of cancers, that's not what we do in the United States with our healthcare system. And I am not about to go out on a rant here, but people who have listened to the show before know that we don't pay to be healthy in this country. We pay in an illness model, meaning that you need to have signs, symptoms, and diseases, and then we're going to try to treat the symptoms of that. Whereas if you simply could figure out how to focus, boy, is it not simple. When I say simply, I almost have to stop myself right there. But if you can figure out how to get enough sleep, and here I've had a couple of conversations with a friend, John Chron, who's a sleep expert, and we're almost guilty to piling on the sleep thing because it is all the rave nowadays, much like gut health. You hear about it all the time, which further stresses people out when they're not getting adequate sleep. But it does start there for me to a certain extent. And then if you can layer in diet, and you're saying a diverse diet, along with exercise, and then do what you can to mitigate stress, then even these things are going to improve your gut health. So I just really wanted to emphasize that.
I totally agree. And in fact, I would say they are surprisingly hard to achieve. If you go to your doctor tomorrow, it's unlikely they give you a prescription for a bag of vegetables at your local store. But maybe that's what we should be doing, right? A prescription to say, here's supplemental healthy fruit and vegetables for the next 2 weeks for your diet. We end up on the back end. We have incredibly costly therapies to treat very complicated diseases when they're fully up and running and established. We spend very little time trying to prevent these diseases on the front end because, and let's be honest, it's hard to stick to a healthy diet, exercise, low stress consistently. Yeah, our lives aren't built to make those easy to do.
Is it different in Ireland? I'm thinking about my wife who's from Italy, born and raised in Italy. And it's like, here you need a prescription, you're saying you're recommending for the right foods, but that's not the way it is in Italy. It's just they eat healthy foods. There's talk of these blue zones where people live longer, they live better, they have less chronic disease, and they have less cancers. You say to them, hey, how much do you exercise? And the answer is, I don't exercise. But the truth is they're in constant movement. They're walking. They're working in their garden. Some of them are even making their own flour and whatever it takes to make your own flour. And all of this is activity. And so they do that. And the other thing is that they are embedded in family. And so we know that loneliness, or being alone, I should say, is very poorly correlated with good health. I wish I could have said that in a much more elegant way. I had to work hard to actually make that as bad as that was. But I think you're following me, which is, if that's a part of your mojo, which is like I spend a lot of time with friends and family, then that's just a part of who you are and what you do. And that's what I was asking you. That's a very long way to say, is it different in Ireland? When you were there, did you perceive this difference? Or does Ireland also have a more of an illness model more than a wellness one?
Yeah, countries where there's a lot more social stability in terms of social networks, they're often those blue zones, right? Where there's an extended family, they meet regularly, there's a social cohesion there. In the US, in contrast, you have a lot more people moving cities and across in all states all the time, and that breaks down some of that. Certainly that social network is important to longevity. It's important to general overall health. And I don't know if the research on it yet, but I suspect probably also beneficial to gut health. But I don't know if there's particular research on that.
Okay. When I asked you what are the most important things you can do, you went into a very precise answer, which is pay attention to your diet and exercise and now stress mitigation. Of course, we blew that up. So what else?
Yeah, so the second one I mentioned were probiotics. So most people think about probiotics as bacteria that you're adding into your system. They can be live cultures, they can be freeze-dried bacteria. The thing to know about probiotics are, for most of us, if you have a healthy, diverse microbiome, adding these probiotics in probably makes very little change to your overall composition, because you'd have to take a large dose of a mix of multiple different bacteria every day consistently to really see change. And we've seen this in research studies, actually studies from Italy, where patients took a course of probiotics and their stool microbiome was measured every day. The minute they stopped taking that mixed course of probiotics, their stool microbiome goes back to how it was before. So you're not really inserting a new species into the forest, to use our analogy, that's going to be permanent. These are often transient shifts. So probiotics can shift to a small degree, but you're not going to reset your entire microbiome by adding in probiotics. So to be honest, in most probiotics, the levels are very low, and it's only one or two strains, not multiple different strains.
I'd like for you to define probiotics and differentiate it from prebiotics.
Yeah, so the probiotics at a high level are just the actual bacteria. They're either live or freeze-dried or whatever. The prebiotics are defined as foods or substrates that actually feed the probiotics. So basically food for your bacteria. So prebiotics are molecules, substrates, whatever you want to call them, chemicals that you're taking that are known to help bacteria grow in your gut. Probiotics are the actual bacteria themselves.
And the prebiotics, so of course, yogurt, kimchi, sauerkraut, these type of things, these are prebiotics, which are the foods that we eat.
Some of the foods you mentioned, like yogurts, have both, right? They have probiotics and they have some prebiotics. Some fermented foods often have bacteria in them, and they have some contents that can help for bacteria to grow.
Now, where's the value when it comes to spending money on prebiotics or probiotics? Because people spend a lot of money on them.
They do.
Is there improved quality as a result of that expense? Is there value there?
So I think of this in two ways. For the most part, there's very little downside or harm. So if you want to do it, it's not going to harm you. I will give one explanation about scenarios where it has shown to be detrimental. And so there was an important study a couple of years ago where they gave people antibiotics and they looked and see how fast could they recover their microbiome. And there were three ways, right? Just normal recovery, recovery by taking probiotics, or recovery by doing a fecal transplant, which is taking stool from a healthy individual and then adding it into the gut. Surprisingly, in this study, the people who took the probiotics took longer to recover back to their prior normal microbiome after the antibiotics, because the argument was that the probiotics at that time were outcompeting their own normal bacteria to recover. And so while in most cases probiotics won't do you any harm, in some scenarios they may actually be competing with your normal healthy keystone bacteria that you need as part of your normal microbiome. But for the most part, at the doses people are taking and the levels they're taking, there's really no harm. They may be adding a small amount only as long as you're taking them to diversity. But once you stop taking them, you lose that additional effect.
All right. Well, I want to make sure I really clean that up because my son is in his second year of college. Of course, he goes to school and immediately gets strep throat and started a course of antibiotics. My wife said to him, hey, you should start taking some probiotics. But the literature would suggest that by taking probiotics after antibiotics, we're actually delaying the return to my normal gut biome.
Certainly in that study, they delayed of some particular species growing back. And so it's certainly, I'm not saying it's detrimental, but it certainly raised questions about the assumed benefits of you're going to just speed up recovery. That may not be the case.
Does that also include people who are on antibiotics and develop diarrhea? I know that there is an entity which is antibiotic-induced diarrhea. Is that different?
Actually, that's a very interesting question because there are a subgroup of people who develop just diarrhea on antibiotics. And the theory behind it is that the antibiotics are preferentially killing the bacteria in your gut that break down sugars. And when you can't do that, the sugars cause diarrhea because by osmosis, they draw more fluid into your gut. So in that specific situation, there may be some benefit from taking probiotics like lactobacilli to replace these bacteria until your own native bacteria can recover. So in that scenario, yes, there may be some benefit only if it's just diarrhea from specific antibiotics. I will also add that if you're getting persistent diarrhea after antibiotics, we have to watch out for an infection called C. diff, which can also occur after antibiotics. And that has a different solution. So short, a couple of days of diarrhea, no problem. 2-3 weeks of diarrhea, even after the antibiotics are gone, that should.
Do you take prebiotics and probiotics?
So inadvertently in my diet, I do a lot of fruits. I had kiwi this morning. Kiwi has been shown to be, beneficial. There's prebiotics in kiwi, helps with stool regularity. So I don't intentionally take probiotics on a daily basis, but I do take lots of prebiotics in the foods I eat.
Okay, helpful. I think I'm the same way, which is I just try to eat a diverse diet, and I'm always sure to include certain foods. I'm not good at the kimchis and the kombucha, but I tend to eat yogurt and other foods that may be helpful.
So to add to that, so we're not just on fermented foods, but for example, fiber, high fibrous foods, inulin in foods, also good for bacterial growth and considered to be prebiotics.
We couldn't possibly talk about gut health and not talk about fiber. So let's go there. Fiber, what is its impact, and what is your take overall on fiber in one's diet?
So fiber has two presumed roles. One is it encourages that your stool concentration has plenty of liquid in it or fluid, because if your stool is too dry, it's very hard to expel. You need, for want of a better word, a bulky stool to encourage normal gut motility. So that's one role.
And that's because the fiber in the gut will draw water essentially in the gut and help with the transit through the GI tract.
Correct. The fiber in the stool draws water into the stool, so it's not too dehydrated. So it hydrates your stool, and a good bulky stool encourages motility to move things along. We went way deeper there than I thought we would on this conversation.
Oh no, I have no fear. I will go as deep into the bowel as we need to.
And then the second piece is fiber is considered to contain prebiotics, which also encourages health of good bacteria.
So I asked you, what are your recommendations? You talked about a healthy lifestyle. We talked about prebiotics/probiotics. Anything else before we wrap?
In kind of the order would be healthy lifestyle, reduce stress, good sleep, exercise, number 1, number 2, number 3. And then you can consider adding in probiotics, prebiotics, may do some benefit, but probably at a small scale.
Before we actually wrap, I did think of one other thing, and that is alcohol. Alcohol is always in the health media. Alcohol is good for you. Alcohol is bad for you. And right now we are on definitely a run of alcohol is bad for you. And that's a really interesting study that I'm going to get into, or some studies that I'll talk about later in the show that were probably misinterpreted. And the data have always been there suggesting that alcohol really isn't good for you. That said, many people say, within moderation, no problem. What's its impact on gut health?
Yeah, I'd say it's actually much smaller in terms, in gut health, so not liver. We leave liver out of this one. But
let's not. I think it's safe to say that excessive alcohol is certainly bad for you and will have bad impacts on the liver and other organs. But
Correct.
Specifically, I'm talking about the microbiome and gut health.
The impact on the gut microbiome is pretty small, and it may be varied by the types of alcohol. If you're drinking a lot of beer has a lot of sugar, high sugar content. That tends to influence what kind of bacteria are thriving in your intestinal tract, and maybe ones that you don't want an excess of. Other things like wine, spirits, it's very minimal impact. And so I would say of all the things we've talked about today, alcohol is probably the one that has the smallest impact. But like many things, moderation is key, and excess of anything is going to disrupt the normal flow of your intestinal tract, disrupt the normal microbial composition.
Alan, before we end our conversation, is there a book that you would recommend for people to learn more about their gut health?
Great question. I would caution that there's a lot of good science around this, but also some pseudoscience. And so we've got to be careful about what we're getting information from. A good book to think about is a book called Follow Your Gut by Rob Knight. Rob is a big microbiome researcher in San Diego. And this book is based on a TED talk he gave, which kind of oversees all of these different topics we've discussed and gives some practical advice on what we call following your gut.
That's interesting because you said it started with a TED Talk. So if people want to get almost a preview for what the book might be, then go ahead and Google. You said his name is Rob Knight, and
Yes.
He did a TED Talk?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Alan Moss, I want to thank you for your time today. You've been so generous with your time, especially because we've tried to do this before and it hasn't worked out. I loved this conversation. I learned a lot from it. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. Pleasure to be here.
And thanks to all of you for listening. I want to hear your thoughts about the episode. Do you have any questions? Are there topics that I should cover? If so, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer. That's our show for today. The show was produced by me and Batsheva Gez. Until next time, be well.